Good evening, everyone. Folks want to grab a seat. We're going to begin the presentation tonight. So thanks, everybody, for coming. My name's John Reiner. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the town. And thanks for coming to our kickoff meeting for our Meeting in the Middle project. Tonight we have some folks that are going to be talking some real specifics about the bigger project and then doing some deep dive into some of the housing stuff of what's happening in town. Again, thanks for coming. The way tonight will work, I think Jeff will go over this as well. We got food in the back. Feel free to get up anytime, grab some food. The boards are up in the back. We'll do some like sticky board exercises. And at the end, we'll have some additional time for Q&A between the consultants and the other staff members that are here. But thanks again for coming. And I'll hand things over to Jeff Davis from the Horsley Witten Group. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, John. Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right. Great. So as John said, my name is Jeff Davis, and I'm with the Horsley Witten Group, and we are the lead consultant on this project, which we're calling Meeting in the Middle, Unlocking Housing Opportunities in Groton. So what is this project all about? And I'll be really brief because my colleagues, Tom and Rachel, will be diving into greater detail on this. But in brief, Groton, like the rest of the region, like the rest of the country, is really experiencing a housing shortage. The limited number of homes available are often unaffordable for the people who live here and dominated by either single-family homes on the one end or larger apartment buildings on the other. And these two housing types, of course, meet the needs of a lot of people, but they don't meet the needs of everyone. And we are seeing that demographics are changing in Groton in the region. And again, Tom is going to get into more details on this. In particular, household sizes are shrinking. We have a much larger percentage of households in Groton who are now one person, two people, small households that need different types of housing than what we're offering today. So this project aims to explore how the town might go about creating more housing choice throughout neighborhoods in the town. And it will study the feasibility of something called missing middle housing, which, to be very succinct, is really anything between your typical single-family house on the one end and those larger apartment buildings. So anything in between, and I'll be showing you an example of what that might look like in a second. But before we go any further, we really want to acknowledge how this effort is supported, and I will read this verbatim. This effort is possible under contract with the Southeastern Connecticut Council of Governments with financial support from the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation in the Department of Defense and an intergovernmental agreement between CCOG and the town of Groton. So we always give the caveat, since this is federally funded, the content of this presentation reflects the views of the town of Groton and does not necessarily reflect the views of the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation or the Department of Defense. So, as I mentioned, what is missing middle housing? This is a pretty famous graphic that's used all around the country to explain this concept. You can see on the one end, it ranges from duplexes, those two-family homes, to a triplex or a fourplex, often called a triple-decker here in New England, courtyard apartments, bungalows, townhouses, anywhere up to those smaller scale apartment buildings. And right now in Groton, you can technically build these things within your commercial zones, within your mixed use zones, but there is no distinction between a 3-family and a 75-unit apartment building. And so there may be opportunities for defining those missing middle types and determining that they may be appropriate in some areas of town where those larger scale apartment buildings are not. Want to give a little caveat that missing middle housing is not affordable housing per se. It is not deed restricted affordable housing, and that is not what this project is about. That said, missing middle housing is generally more naturally affordable than larger single-family homes because they are smaller in scale on smaller lots and generally are less expensive. Also, we want to point out that this project is not the plan of conservation and development. It is definitely related, but it is separate, and it will be informing the housing and land use policies of the POCD. So just to give you a sense of what to expect with this project, what we are trying to deliver for the town, the first piece is what we're here to talk with you about tonight, this regional housing demand study. And again, we'll be talking about that in more detail for the rest of the evening. After this demand study, we're going to try to look into what are those missing middle housing types that might be appropriate in Groton, and where might they be beneficial in the community. Next, we're going to work on a build-out analysis. So based on the demand that Camoin has been analyzing, we'll try to think through, all right, how much of that demand can be met by your existing zoning today, what you allow today? How much might be accommodated through other changes to your zoning? So do a range of analyses on what this might look like on the ground. We're also going to look at up to 10 scenarios, so opportunity sites, specific sites where we can test these different housing types and see on a specific parcel, if you were to build this, what would that look like, and how would it integrate with the surrounding neighborhood, so we can learn lessons about how to craft the last step, regulations, if desired, if the town goes through this process and decides, yes, we like some of these housing types, we want to make them easier to build in certain parts of town, then what would we have to do to change the regulations in order to accommodate those preferences? So we've got a big team working on this, myself and a number of my colleagues at the Horsley Witten Group. Of course, we've got Camoin, who are with us tonight, who are more economic development experts in looking at that housing demand. Kronberg Urbanists and Architects are really specialized in trying to unlock the potential for housing like this. They look not only at regulations and zoning, but also at financing, how banks support funding for this type of development, what the pain points are, and how building codes, for example, make these housing types easier or more difficult to achieve. We've also got Barrett Planning Group out of Massachusetts, who are a regional expert on housing policy, and Union Studio, who is an architectural firm based in Providence, who have really spent a lot of their career looking at how to make these smaller scale multifamily developments compatible in a New England environment. And of course, we're also very much in partnership with the Town of Groton, the Office of Planning and Development Services, the Planning and Zoning Commission, and a couple steering groups who are members of the public. Some of you are here tonight. Thank you so much, who can help guide this process. A few other things to note before I turn it over to Camoin. We have a second public meeting for this project in January 22nd, right back here in this room, same time. And at that point, we will be giving a presentation on the different housing typologies, and we'll have a discussion about which you think would be useful in Groton and where you think they would be helpful to be located. Third public meeting will be held in March. Location to be determined, hopefully back here, we're not sure yet, but March 5th. And at that point, we'll be discussing if the town should be making any zoning changes to accommodate these housing types. Some other things coming up more recently, we're going to be doing a walking tour of housing in Mystic. So there is a lot of missing middle housing that already exists in town. And so we will be starting on October 23rd, 4:30 p.m. And I think the location has changed. Bryce, remind me where the walking tour is starting. Courtyard of Factory Square, October 23rd. And then in November, we'll do a similar walking tour in the Pequannock Bridge area, really the two areas of town that have some of the types of housing that we're talking about. Almost done with my piece. One slide that the Kronberg Urbanists and Architects like to share is this concept of abundance versus scarcity when it comes to housing. Most of us want stable services, stable municipal services. We generally want low taxes. Most people also want low density. And it's really difficult, if not impossible, to have all three at once. So one of the things that we like to discuss is, if you do allow more density in certain targeted areas, it can really help you stabilize your services and keep taxes low. So that's another one of the goals of this project. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Tom Doretsky and Rachel Selsky of Camoin. They are going to tonight give you a quick recap of a couple previous studies that were done for the town in 2021 and 2023 on housing demand, and then provide you with information on demographic and economic trends that have been shaping housing demand in Groton and the region. So this report, unlike 2021 and 2023's, looks at the entire region and projects housing demand for different types of housing based on the way that households have been forming in Groton and the region. I will say, and we'll talk about this a little bit more after their presentation, but just as you're listening to this, really important that the study itself is not prescribing a list of recommendations at this point. Rather, this is just data for the town to use to make decisions about land use and housing policy moving forward. And so after the presentation, John and I will talk very briefly about how we see this data and information being used by the town as we move forward with this project. And after that, we'll open it up to question and answers. And as John said, at any point, please help yourself to food, beverages. Restrooms are to the rear, right behind you and to the left. And with that, I'll invite up my colleagues from Camoin.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having you, Jeff and John. Thank you for the introduction. I am Rachel Selsky. I'm the CEO at Camoin Associates. I'm here with my colleague, Tom Doretsky. We at Camoin Associates are a data analytics firm with a focus on economic development, including real estate market analysis, housing demand studies, and strategies. We worked in the town of Groton and in Connecticut for many years now, doing a lot of this similar type of work where we're looking at the existing conditions and what does that mean for housing? What does it mean for economic development? And so here tonight, we will be presenting some work that we've done over the last 4 or so months since late spring, really digging into the existing housing conditions in the town of Groton and in the region, and understanding what does that then mean for the next steps of this project as we consider what are the missing middle housing units, and how can those be more fully accommodated in the town if that's what the town does want to do. But as with any kind of planning project, the first step is always to understand your existing conditions and move forward from there. But with that, I will hand it over to Tom to really dig into the data.
Thanks, Rachel. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Glad to be here this evening to speak with you all. So just to kind of take you through our roadmap for the evening, we'll be starting looking at demographic and market trends. What's been happening locally in Groton and in the region when it comes to population, the economy, and the real estate market. Then we'll talk a bit about the purpose of housing demand analysis, how to look at the results and understand how they can be used to make decisions about land use. We'll recap prior results from the studies we conducted in 2021 and 2023, also on housing. Then we'll present the latest projections, 2035 housing demand projections that are part of this study. And then we'll end by talking about how missing middle housing can fill some of the need uncovered in the study. So key findings. This section really kind of sets the context around household growth, the demographic makeup of Groton, the regional economy, housing market trends, and the impacts that these different things will have on the community's housing needs into the future and the type of housing that can satisfy those needs. So first chart up here, one of the more striking trends in Groton is around the fact that population and households are moving in different directions. So between 2010 and 2025, the town's population, just counting individuals, declined by about 5.7%. Going back to the population peak of the town, that was back in 1990. Since then, the town's lost about 16% of its population. So on the surface, that seems like, oh, Groton's shrinking. But important is the fact that the number of households is actually increasing. So households have grown by 4.1% since 2010 and more than 10% by 1990. So the fact that Groton has more households today than it did in the past, even though the population is lower, means that there is increasing demand for housing. And what explains that? The main factor is that households are smaller. The average household size fell from 2.31 people in 2010 to 2.17 people in 2025. And this is a common trend that we see throughout the country in communities. As populations age, we see smaller households, we see more single-person households, and so that drives housing demand even when population is declining slightly. So to look at that a little bit further, the data here shows kind of the growth in households by number of people in each household. So you see kind of comparing a 10-year period, 2013 compared to 2023. On the left of your screen, you see single-person households, two-person households. Those have increased as a share of the total household makeup of the town, whereas the larger households, three-person households, four-person plus households, those have declined. So that really kind of sets the context for the type of housing that is needed as we see smaller housing, smaller households. And we can compare that to the existing housing stock in the town. 58% of homes in Groton are single family, so a majority are single family, and those usually are more kind of aligned with the needs of larger households. And then 29% of units are in that kind of missing middle category, and 11% are in the larger kind of 19 plus unit category. So as the town's makeup shifts, the housing stock will need to shift as well. Moving on to some employment trends, kind of the regional economic context. This chart is showing the trajectory of percent change in employment relative to 2019. So you see the kind of the trough there in the middle, that was 2020. That was kind of the COVID year where we saw a drop off in employment. But before that, just before that in 2019, that was kind of close to the peak of jobs. And the story is kind of different depending on what level you look at. If you look at the regional market, which is the green line, the bottom line on the right side there, the number of jobs in the region, which is roughly defined as southeastern Connecticut plus Westerly and Hopkinton, the number of jobs in the region is down 1.2% from where it was at the peak before COVID. Meanwhile, in Groton, the count of jobs is up 4.2%, and that's largely driven by EB. So we see kind of, whereas in the previous studies, we assumed that a portion of the jobs that the new electric boat hires would be kind of moving out of to fill EB positions might be backfilled by new residents into the region. We're seeing that really job growth has been stable to slightly declining, so we're seeing less in-migration than we would have thought. While EB still has a lot of hiring needs, the fact that overall the regional employment base has declined slightly means needing to import less new people to fill those jobs. So that will come up again later. So specific to electric boat continues to be the single biggest driver of economic growth in Groton, not a surprise. But the way hiring is played out is different than what other earlier studies assumed. So here's a trajectory. In 2017, EB employed about 16,000 workers across southeastern Connecticut and Quonset, Rhode Island. By 2025, that number had grown to about 24,000 workers, and 5,000 of those new workers have been added just over the past 4 years. So EB is certainly hiring a lot, and they're continuing to hire as they have announced they would. The company's long-term goal is to reach 30,000 workers by the early 2030s, and of that, about 60% would be in the southeastern Connecticut region, versus the 40% would be in Quonset and Rhode Island. And so the makeup of this hiring is important when it comes to housing demand. So about 70% of recent hires in the Groton area have been tradespeople, people like welders, fitters, machinists, those sorts of folks. And EB has largely been able to source those workers locally, meaning not needing to import new people into the region. Not all, but many have been able to be filled locally. About 30% are in that more kind of white-collar professional group. That's a group that's more likely to be recruited from outside of the region. So as EB continues to hire, they're expected to shift their hiring from more tradespeople to more white-collar professionals, and as a result, in the later years of this kind of projection period, we're expecting to see a need to import more talent from outside the region that might not exist. So while to date, not a lot of out-of-region hiring, or not as much as initially anticipated, that's expected to shift as the makeup of the hiring shifts. All right, so now let's talk about housing. So this graph is showing specific to owner housing in Groton. So the bottom line there in dark blue, that's median household income. Median household income in Groton has increased 37% from 2013 over a 10-year period. Compare that to the median home sale price, which has increased 71%. You start to see kind of a mismatch in affordability. And then the top line there, the yellow line, that would be the mortgage payment on a newly purchased median home. So that's more than doubled over this 10-year period. And that's a combination of the home prices increasing substantially and interest rates increasing substantially. So while people that purchased their home prior to 2021, when things started to spike, have not seen a substantial increase in their mortgage payments, people that have newly purchased homes are paying much more for their mortgage than folks that newly purchased, before that bump. So we see this is a pretty kind of major disconnect in affordability that's happened over the past couple of years. Putting some more numbers on that, the median sale price for a single-family home in Groton was about $400,000 in 2024. To afford that, a household would need a household income of about $150,000, whereas the actual median household income in Groton is about $83,000. So $67,000 lower than you would need to afford the median single-family home. Condos are a bit more affordable, $250,000, but still requiring an income of over $100,000 and above the median for the town. So clearly there is an affordability issue in town, but it is not unique to Groton. We're seeing this all over the country. Moving on to renter housing, the median gross rent in Groton has increased about 33% over 10 years, whereas renter income has increased by about 25%. So it has not kept up when you're comparing income and rent. Looking at that just kind of a different way, prior to about 2018, the median renter income was affordable to, or the median renter was able to afford the median rent. That started to change about 2019, and we start to see that gap. This concept of housing affordability often uses the concept of cost burden. So cost burden means a household that is paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So if a household is paying more than 30% of their gross income on housing costs, they're considered cost burdened. Nearly a third of Groton households fall into that category of being cost burdened. When we look at renters, that jumps up to 45%. And of the renters, about half of those cost burdened renters are what we call severely cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than half of their income on housing. So it's a substantial portion of the population in Groton that is considered cost burdened. So that's clearly a need for housing that is better aligned with the resources that folks have based on their incomes. Shifting gears a little bit to commuting trends, as this also impacts housing demand. Groton continues to be a net importer of workers, meaning that many more people commute into Groton than commute out of Groton. Only about 18% of Groton workers live and work in the town, whereas 82% of the town's workforce, the folks that work in Groton, commute from a different community in the area. So this points to a potential mismatch in housing that might align with the needs of workers. Not everyone wants to live in the community where they work, but many do. And having kind of this 82% in-commuter rate suggests that there's probably opportunity to provide housing for more folks that work in town. Looking at development trends, there's been a large increase in permitting activity in Groton recently. So that's a sign that the market is responding to the needs of folks that are looking for housing, and so they're starting to build. So we saw in 2023 and 2024, each of those years over 200 permits for units of housing, the majority of those being multifamily. So that's a sign that the supply picture is shifting a little bit after several years of relatively low building activity. And again, this mirrors what we've seen around the country as well, kind of the years after 2008 and the Great Recession, very limited housing supply being added, whereas recently it's been picking up. So that's a sign that the market's responding. Recent multifamily developments, the town has seen 4 projects and 570 units built since 2020. You're probably all familiar with some of these and their locations around town. So beyond that, there's plans for another 1,270 units that have been approved but not yet built throughout the town of Groton. Okay. So that is kind of the baseline trends. Now we're going to shift into the portion of the presentation looking at housing demand analysis. So before we jump into those numbers, just want to kind of set the stage for the purpose of housing demand analysis, why we do it. So first, the purpose of this demand analysis, as Jeff said earlier, it's not to dictate what the town has to do or must do. It's just kind of providing an objective baseline, an order of magnitude understanding of the data. How much housing demand potential is there in the town? If we wanted to build housing in town, what do the needs look like that we want to respond to? So it shows future housing needs based on data and trends. It identifies gaps between existing housing and resident needs. Where is there a misalignment? Where are there, for example, too many large single-family homes compared to an increasing number of smaller households that don't need so much space or can't afford so much space? Provides an objective baseline for discussion and planning. Everyone can work from kind of the same set of numbers when we're discussing how to respond to this need. And again, it highlights opportunities, not mandates, not any sorts of quotas. We don't have to build all of these homes. It's just showing what the market could potentially support. Aligning zoning, infrastructure, and policy with likely demand. And bottom line is supporting informed decisions for growth as we talk about the plan for development in town. So how do we interpret housing demand projections here? Again, this kind of shows potential for a certain number of units. You'll hear me talk about different unit counts based on the different sources of demand. This doesn't mean those units are definitely going to be built in town or we have to build them. It's not a forecast of construction necessarily. It's just a measure of market capacity. And there's a lot of different things that will impact what actually gets built. So financial feasibility is critical. If the numbers don't pencil out for a developer, if they can't make a profit on it, they're likely not going to build it. So that's going to be critical for any type of housing that gets built. You gotta have infrastructure capacity and enough water, sewer, all of those things for housing units to be built. Zoning has to align, regulatory environment, and then market timing, investor interest as well. Again, developers are going to do their own market studies when it comes to building housing for their specific type of product. And the market's going to change over the next 10 years. Interest rates are going to go up and down. There's going to be changes in the economy. Demographics are going to continue to shift. And so all of those things are going to impact what type of development actually happens. But these projections kind of highlight the opportunity that there's market potential for more housing choices in town. And we'll look at that over the next 10 years. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to recap the initial studies. So just for the folks that aren't familiar, Camoin Associates prepared 2 prior housing studies for the town of Groton, an initial one in 2021. This graphic might look familiar to those that might have seen that, and then an update to the 2021 study 2 years later. So the 2021 study determined that there was capacity or potential for about 5,200 units of housing in Groton over a 10-year period through the end of 2030. And that demand came from several key groups. First, new electric boat workers and backfilling of those workers for retirements and other positions. That accounted for about 1,900 potential housing units. Rental upgraders, which are people that already live in the area, but who could afford to move into newer or higher quality housing if it were available. So folks living in kind of, units that are maybe dated and would prefer updated units if they were available. Commuters, so people working in Groton but living outside town who might move here if the right housing existed. And then new workers in the broader region that are connected to EB through economic multiplier effects. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then households in obsolete housing, so older units that are at risk of needing to be replaced. So when you add all of that together, we got to about 5,200 units of housing demand over 10 years in Groton specifically. 2023 study, same kind of approach and methodology, just updated data. Over this period, EB announced that they were going to ramp up hiring more than they had initially projected. So that kind of drove the majority of that increase in number of units projected in the 2023 study. So that jumped up to about 6,400 units over 10 years. And like I said, kind of similar numbers across the board with electric boat workers really being the place where they increased the most. Okay, so now getting into the 2025 study. Just to orient everyone, we'll talk about the town of Groton. You all know what that is. We'll also talk about the regional market area that's shown on this map here. It's about 23 cities and towns, most in southeastern Connecticut, plus Hopkinton and Westerly in Rhode Island. Together, this region accounts for over 70% of Groton's in-commuters. So 70+% of people that work in Groton live in one of these communities within this regional market area. So that represents basically the regional housing market. Okay. So the latest demand projections, we're looking at, again, a 10-year period, 2025 through 2035. Jumping straight to the headline finding, future housing demand in Groton is projected to range from about 4,100 to 5,600 units by 2035. based on 2 development or growth scenarios that we looked at. The higher scenario, the 5,600-ish unit scenario, that falls between the results of the 2021 and 2023, so we're in the same general ballpark. The lower scenario is about 1,000 units lower than the 2021 study. So if we took kind of the mid-range of those 2, it's pretty close to the original 2021 study, and we'll talk about why that is. So nothing kind of earth-shattering here. We're kind of, in the same general ballpark of the housing unit needs that we'll need for Groton. At the regional level, we're projecting 17,000 units in scenario 1 and about 18,000 plus in scenario 2. And within those kind of regional numbers, the Groton numbers account somewhere around 25 to 30% of that regional total. And again, that's largely driven by EB, the fact that most of that job growth is happening in Groton or very close to Groton. A lot of the housing demand is also in the area. What's the difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2? Scenario 1 is the lower scenario. That assumes that out-of-region hiring from Electric Boat continues at levels we've seen over the past few years. I mentioned earlier kind of a lower level of out-of-region hiring than initially anticipated because they can fill jobs locally more so. Scenario 2 assumes that EB has to recruit more workers from out of the region, and as that the shift to needing more professional or specialized workers and kind of the labor pool here might get more kind of used up. So we might see higher housing demand as a result of that. And scenario 2 also assumes that a small portion of folks currently commuting into Groton might move to Groton if housing options align with their needs, and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to walk through the different components of demand. This might be a little bit in the weeds for some folks, but I know some people are interested in the methodology, so I'll try to keep it as high level as possible. Here are the different sources we're going to look at, similar to the prior studies, but housing demand by 2035. We're going to talk about baseline household formation, so that's kind of underlying household growth based on historic trends. The EB-driven household growth, that's going to vary between the 2 scenarios. The replacement demand, that's the units that need to be replaced in the housing stock, units at risk of needing to be removed due to disrepair, those sorts of things. The renter upgraders, those who might choose a higher quality renter unit or home ownership option if that was available at their price point, and then the increased in commuter households. All right, so the first component here, baseline household formation. This is reflecting historic trends in household formation. In migration, natural increase in households, but really the most notable factor in this region is household size decline. So we talked before about smaller households. That can happen in a number of ways. You got more older adults living alone, rather than, in past decades, you might have seen more older adults living with their children or grandchildren. Now you're seeing more older adults living alone. You're seeing more single-person households rather than couples as people delay marriage. You see, a lot of single households, divorce, separation, all of those things leads to kind of more household formation. And so based on that kind of just baseline trend, that would result in about 800 new households in Groton over 10 years. New electric boat households. As I mentioned before, overall EB hiring is continuing as expected, but the rate of out-of-region hiring is lower than previously projected. So scenario 1, where that lower rate of hiring from out of the region, 770 new households in Groton. That's considerably below, the 1,900 households or so that we projected earlier in 2021. Again, that's a result of the fact that we're hiring more within the region, don't need to import households as much. Scenario 2, that bumps up to 1,200 in Groton. Indirect households. So this is when we refer to the economic multiplier effect This is when you see other economic impacts that occur as a result of electric boat growing in the region. So they are supporting jobs in other industries in their supply chain as they make purchases from other companies that might grow in the area. The workers at Electric Boat are making purchases in the local economy. All of that drives more economic growth locally. And so what we call the economic multiplier effect for Electric Boat is 1.96. And what that means is for every new job at Electric Boat, we anticipate another 1.96 jobs in the regional market as a result of that. So that comes out to another, relatively small number, but 168 to 183 new EB households in Groton, that should say indirect households as a result of EB. Housing stock replacements. This is the number of homes that are likely to be rebuilt or replaced as older housing naturally leaves the inventory. In Groton, about 15% of homes were built before 1940, so an older housing stock. And so based on that age of the housing stock, just naturally a lot of, a share of the housing stock turns over each year. About 0.2% or so per year is kind of the estimate based on the breakdown of income levels and renter versus owner type makeup in Groton. So over that 10-year period, it's about 2% of the total housing stock that might need to be replaced. And that would be homes that are basically past their useful life. They're too old, worn out, outdated, and like not worth fixing up or kind of past the point of being able to be fixed. So that comes out to about 350 homes in Groton over the 10-year period. Renter upgraders, that's kind of refers to that mismatch between the existing housing stock and the desire for higher quality rentals or attainable housing or home ownership options. We looked before at kind of a very high level of income that's needed to afford the median home in Groton if you're looking to purchase. So there's a lot of folks in the region that would purchase if they could, but they don't have enough income, or the housing stock that's available for purchase isn't there. So if those options were available, we could see a significant number of additional demand resulting from those renter upgrader households. And then finally, increased in commuting. This is where we assume that what if 5% of current Groton incommuters chose to live in town by 2035? Relatively small number, probably a reasonable assumption to think that about 5% or so of folks would live in Groton if the right housing choices were available. That comes out to about 1,000 new households. So summarizing that all together, again, the lower scenario about 4,100 units, the higher scenario about 5,600 units. And those units kind of cross all kinds of different types of needs. New households moving in, owners versus renters, existing renters looking to upgrade, older adults seeking downsizing options, replacement of aging homes. There's a lot of different dynamics at play here and different groups at all income levels across the spectrum that can be met by the market in many different ways. So we're just it's difficult to predict how the market's going to meet those needs, but the purpose of this study is to kind of envision what sorts of combinations of unit types might meet the needs of the population. And then we just compare that to the pipeline of housing units in Groton, those projects that have been approved but not built yet. There's about 1,270 of those. As we talked about before, they're primarily higher density multifamily rentals. So that's only going to appeal to a segment of this population of need into the future. So, there's probably a need for a diversity of different unit types beyond just those multifamily rentals. There's a lot on this slide, but it's just kind of helpful to look at it when we're thinking about the types of housing units that might appeal or meet the needs of these different populations. look at different like lifestyle segments or household types. You know, how do the preferences of young adults differ from established adults with no kids, or active seniors, or higher income families. We can look at that across, you know, how do higher density versus middle density versus single family units potentially meet the needs of these different groups. We see that like middle density housing really does meet the needs of a lot of these groups to some extent. Things like townhomes or duplexes, smaller multifamily buildings. It's kind of a sweet spot in that it's, you know, they're typically more affordable, as Jeff said, but also gives kind of, you know, a little bit more space or privacy than a higher density building. So, you know, while higher density and single family options each also serve important roles, and the purpose of this study is really to kind of look at how middle density housing stands out and can meet the needs of these different groups. And last slide here. Bottom line is, when we look at those different housing preferences, we look at those projections through 2035, the different demographic and economic trends that we looked at. Together, those things kind of help us understand who's going to be driving demand, what types of housing they're looking for over the next decade. When we really put it all together, we see that about 2/3 of future housing demand could be met through middle density housing. You know, it doesn't mean that it's going to play out like this. Some of those needs could also be met by other types of housing, but the bottom line is a majority of these this demand that we've identified could be met with missing middle, and the rest of the study is going to kind of look at how different scenarios could look in town as we think about potentially providing these types of units in the market. So before we turn it over, or before we open it up to questions, I'm just going to turn it back to Jeff and John if they'd like to just kind of tie it to the next steps of the study, and then we'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so just to reiterate some of the things I said at the beginning of this, in terms of what does the town do with this information? It can be a little overwhelming to look at these numbers and think, my God, what would the town look like if we all of a sudden had 5,000 new units in the community? So again, our goal is to look at this, to understand the needs of households in Groton moving forward, to look at your existing housing stock, to see what is missing and which housing typologies you would like to better define and promote in the town, if any new ones, and figure out through these build-out scenarios, again, from what would happen if we just really promote these housing units where they're allowed today and better define them and promote them and look for other removing barriers to building them in these areas versus allowing them in areas where they're not allowed today, and how much of this demand could we potentially meet. So these build-out scenarios will again run from what if we just stick with the zoning we have, what could that possibly do, to a sort of shoot the moon if we were to try to capture as much of this demand as possible, what would that look like? And then the community gets to decide which of those scenarios makes the most sense for you, and that balance between meeting that housing need and maintaining your character and identity. John, anything else you'd like to add before we turn it over?
Yeah, so, you know, just sometimes people have asked, well, why are we doing this? You know, we've heard a lot from you, from a lot of members in the community. You know, we need more housing that's attainable, that's affordable. We need more recreation and open space. We need a lot of things. Why are we just getting more and more apartment buildings in town and not this type of housing? You know, so all of this kind of goes into, we just want to give you, the community, and our decision makers, our planning and zoning commission, our town council, and other boards and commissions that make decisions on these future land uses and policies, good data, good information for then all of you to participate in that process and give us direction so we can help you get to that place where you want to be. Again, I can't stress enough, this is not a mandate that we have to do this or anything. But if we want to address the market dynamics, the difference between the supply and the demand, escalating house prices, escalating rental prices, we have to do something. And this gives you some more opportunities with this level of data and information. You know, again, as we move through this project, more public outreach, you know, surveys, the walking tours to show people, you know, what is and what is not different types of housing types. I think that often opens up people's eyes.
Before we open to Q&A, just a reminder that there are people watching at home and this is being recorded. So it's important that you be on microphone too, so that people who are watching and who are not here today can hear what you have to say. I think staff are walking around with microphones.
No.
Is that, no? What's the?
We might be able to get another one, but
Okay.
in the meantime, I can move around with the mic
Okay.
as well. But in the meantime, do folks have questions? And maybe if like people raise your hand, we can kind of cue them up a little bit. I see Kathy has a question in the back.
Yes, and I'm not sure if you can answer this, but I'm going to put it out there in the universe. So it seems that Groton puts all their eggs in the EB basket. And I remember back in 1977 when they had a massive layoff. How do we prevent these ginormous apartment buildings to become blighted if they become empty? I mean, we're getting a lot of big apartment buildings here. So how do you prevent that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point to think about. You know, it is true that this region economy isn't as diversified as others are. That is a risk, certainly. At the same time, there's people today that need housing, so it's kind of tough to say, you know, what if EB doesn't, you know, continue on the path that it is, what could happen? You know, there's a lot of folks that are still going to need housing in the meantime. But yeah, how do we, you know, keeping properties up to, you know, high quality. These newer properties aren't going to be the ones that fall into decline. You know, it's going to be older ones maybe that, you know, are not kept up. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about these newer build ones that are going to be the ones that might be blighted. There's still going to be demand as people naturally kind of gravitate to the better quality housing in the region.
In addition, some of our policies that are going into our current plan of conservation, or some that are in our current plan of conservation and development and that are going into the new one, we'll be talking about. I mean, since I've been here, I've been hearing from a lot of folks, we need to diversify our economy, diversify the tax base. And although we can try to do that, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that EB is the major employer in this region. We're also very fortunate to know very long projections of how long and the types of jobs they're going to have. So with that, we can see, you know, I feel like every week or every other week there's another announcement of $500 million awarded to EB or some other large contract that just keeps extending this time frame of this high level of employment. So we do have a high level of certainty moving out, but then again, you know, fair point about, you know, large apartment complexes. Right now, what the market and our zoning kind of dictate, direct, and are pushing things towards are more the higher level apartment buildings, those bigger buildings. And something we want to look at through this project is how can we make it available, profitable for developers to actually, and people to build accessory dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, and quads, things on a smaller scale that are more neighborhood relatable and not just, you know, 200 unit buildings. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Of the amount you're talking about, let's say 400 homes or construction units a year, what would be the value, roughly? You know, I know there's this variance between the kinds of units, but how much construction value is related to those numbers?
So what's the value of some of the new homes that?
How much is it going to add to local income if, in fact, we're building approximately 350 to 400 a year?
So, you know, and I'd love a little Tom and Rachel's input on this as well, but I recently was talking with a regional developer, does a lot of work within the Groton region, and he was saying, oh, we like to build starter homes. You know, starter homes now, I think, are somewhere in the $450,000 plus range. That's a starter home. That's what it costs to build a starter home. And some of that, again, is It's what zoning drives a starter home to be, because when, we look at, and I think there was some other information we did on another presentation, when you look at comparable sizes of new homes today versus 40 years ago, a starter home back in 1970 might have been under 1,000 square feet, whereas a starter home now is going to probably be closer to 1,800 square feet or 2,000. So there's a lot more cost associated with that. So how can we make it profitable for developers, and some of that might be smaller lot sizes and things that have been very taboo or people are afraid of. But if we get smaller houses, in order to make that profitable, you have to be able to get more houses in that area. So if people started building houses that were 1,200 square feet again, then you might see that price point obviously come down. I don't know if Tom or Rachel, Jeff.
Yeah, I think, are you kind of asking about kind of the impact on the tax base for the town that those new? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so, as John said, that's probably about the value. Maybe you could come in a little bit less for much smaller condos or something, but for a starter home that's not subsidized in any way, probably looking at, no less than 300 or 350 as a sale price, kind of market value price.
And, we often get questions about, well, what about the school population growth and fiscal impacts to the town? And what we're seeing, and this isn't just a Groton thing, this is more regionally, this is nationally, people are having kids later in life, people are having less kids. I mean, everything we're seeing, all the national trends or household sizes are dropping. So we're not seeing that boom of school-age children that we used to see, or that I think, a lot of you probably saw in the 80s and the 90s, and that massive growth in the tax rates that went up because of that. I'm not saying we're not going to see any growth of school-age kids, but just look at the trends. Think about people when are they having kids? How many people do you know that have not had any children? Very different trends from that end. And then when we look at it from a cost and tax-paying perspective, Triton Square, the old Sealy School, that is almost fully done and operational, and we're expecting that to be paying north of $1 million a year in new property taxes. That was something that was not on the tax rolls before. That'll probably be in the top 5 taxpayers in town once that is complete, after we do the new reval, I think next year.
I have a quick question here. I'm curious about what impact all of this housing development that you're talking about, 5,000 units, in Groton and then in the region. It's in Groton that I'm most concerned about. There's much more space in the region. But how much land would be required to meet the need?
Yes.
And where would these be built?
So that is exactly what the study is going to look at in the next phases. So right now we're just at kind of, here's the amount of demand, right? Potential you could go after, you don't have to build it all, but if you did, you could meet the needs of 5,000 households. And the next phases of the study are going to look at specific parts of town, what density, what types of units, different scenarios of what that could look like, and getting kind of community input on that and what you might want to see. So Jeff mentioned those other meetings, and when are they? January and March. That's what those are going to go into.
Yeah. And we've had questions from people about, well, can we solve this through accessory dwelling units? We probably get applications in construction for about 12 to 15 accessory dwelling units per year. We're not going to solve our housing crisis with accessory dwelling units. They cost a lot of money to build now as well. We're seeing some of them north of $150,000, $200,000 for an ADU, and the majority of them are being built in the area around Mystic. But yes, I agree with everything Tom said. That's kind of what the next phases of this project get us into. Did you?
No, he's got a question. So the previous number that we had heard out of a similar study was 6,400 units. These two numbers are between 1,000 and 2,000 lower, which is surprising. What's the primary driver for the decrease in housing demand?
Yeah, so the primary driver is kind of that concept of EB hiring outside versus inside of the region. So that is, while the amount of hiring overall that EB is doing is on track with what they've stated, the fact that they've been able to find a higher share of workers already living in the region means that we don't need to import as many new households to the region as initially anticipated before there was some history of actual hiring.
Just wanted to thank you for this informative session, but my question is, I'm just curious, so you did a study in 2021 and 2023 and 2025. What is the town paying for this information, and what do the additional phases cost the town? And secondly, where do you get your updated statistics from? Thank you.
Yes.
So this project, we had a slide for it at the very beginning. So this funding was actually federally funded from the Department of Defense. It's the OLDCC, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the acronym, the office. Yeah. Really long federal acronym. Basically, we realized there was a need for this in town. We put a proposal together to the Department of Defense, knowing that we are the home of, not only a Navy base, but also General Dynamics Electric Boat. The two of them work together. And we've worked with, before it was under a program of the Joint Land Use Study. They've changed the name of their office. But essentially, this is all being federally funded. So this part of the project is not costing directly town of Groton taxpayers money. But yes, are your federal taxes helping to pay for this? Yes. So this whole project, at the end of the day, for this part, is a $350,000 project going through this is just one small part deliverable, the design scenarios, zoning work, public outreach and engagement. Happy to share the scope of work with anybody. The two other previous Camoin studies, don't quote me on it, but I want to say the first one was somewhere around $20,000. The 2021 study, and then the update was less than $10,000 that we did in 2023, somewhere in that ballpark. Right now, there's no other phases. There's this project. Next phases of just this study, the next meetings, there's two other meetings, the couple of walking tours that we're talking about, but this project, to get us to the end right now, which is scheduled for it to end around July 1 of 2026. That's that $350,000 federally funded project. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
And to answer your questions about data sources, variety of data sources, a lot of census data, some proprietary data sources such as CoStar, which is real estate data, multiple listing services, housing type, housing market data, Zillow, Redfin. Esri is another kind of source of demographic data. So I think that's probably the bulk of it. But if you're curious on the details, I'm happy to give you more.
And in projects like this, sometimes people say, oh, $25,000 for that study or $10,000 for an update. That's a lot of money. But when you look at the land use decisions that we're doing, the amount of time as a town we debate some of these issues, we need to have good data, because otherwise we're making broad assumptions. Everybody knows with assumptions and what you do between you and me. So we try to bring good data to the table so we can make good informed decisions. And that's what drives a lot of this. I saw a hand somewhere over here.
I appreciate the work you're putting into the data, and I was just curious, we've lived here over a year and we're leasing because we are the middle income, and when it comes to trying to buy property, we noticed we keep getting beat by investors or people that are buying them and they turn into short-term Airbnb, whatever brand name you want to call them. And I'm just wondering, are you building that into this? Because you're assuming when you put these properties for sale that we're going to be able to compete against people with cash offers.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. This is measuring the demand for households. So in a sense, if an investor builds a home, one of these households will live in it, but they would be a renter. And yeah, that's not, whether they own it or they rent it, it's still the same number of households, but your point is very well taken, and that's an issue here and in many places that, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Right, right, so this is just counting year-round permanent households that would need to live in town. And so, yeah, there's probably additional units beyond that that might get built that will go toward vacation rentals or people that live there just a portion of the year.
Yeah, and you know, this report does take into account the fact that there's it's a little bit less than 300 short-term rentals in the town of Groton now. Is moving forward, a couple of years ago, we adopted new regulations on short-term rentals. It's a much more stringent process. They're not allowed everywhere in town any longer. The ones that are existing are grandfathered in, but you're not gonna see that massive growth of short-term rentals we saw before. There's not a lot we can do from a regulatory perspective, limiting second, third, or fourth home purchases, which sometimes people do. We're a coastal community. We're a very desirable place to live. That's something that it's the blessing and the curse of living on the coast. It's wonderful, it's beautiful. You have a lot of open space. A lot of people want to be here. And that's why as we look at these approaches, you don't want to lose that character and those wonderful things about the town, but we also need to think about, all right, you know, folks like yourself, you want to live here. And you know, you look at, hey, I thought I got a good job, I'm making a good income. Why can't I afford something in this town? And a lot of it's supply and demand. Think about what happened with used cars during COVID. There weren't a whole lot, prices spiked. The same thing's happening with houses. With not a lot of supply, demand here, numbers just keep going up, and those with the resources to outbid everybody else are just gonna keep buying, and we're gonna see the turnover and the gentrification of more and more coastal communities like us, unless we find a way of addressing some of that, you know, supply, not building unlimited, but addressing, you know, what we can now. Sorry, another hand over here.
Hi, so Groton has been highly criticized for having abandoned properties sit for decades. The Oral School property is one example. I know that belonged to the state, but that's besides the point. So why is it taking so long to reuse these properties for something like this, maybe?
Great question, because everybody doesn't agree on how we should move forward. And we want to make sure that any processes we're doing, especially with public property, we got to be as transparent as possible. We have to think about all the different opinions. And I'm sure if I asked everybody in this room what they thought we should do with the Mystic Education Center, the Mystic Oral School, we get a lot of different opinions. And it takes time to figure these things out and to come up with a consensus that the community can live with, and that the decision makers at the town council, as well as the people that elect those council members, the RTM. So like the Oral School, it's a state property, but it's within the town. So how can the town and the state work together? What do we do for the long-term use? You know, right now, if you watch council meetings or read the paper, we're talking about Pleasant Valley School. We're talking about Groton Heights School. Colonel Ledyard School, which is in the city, it's taken a little bit longer than we thought to get construction fully underway, but they're slowly moving forward with that. Triton Square was Sealy School was closed for a lot of years, and it took us some time to get that. These projects take a long time, and part of it is like even Pleasant Valley, if we sign a purchase and sales agreement with a developer, you know, a month from now, they then need to do some due diligence for a few months. They then need to design the project and engineer it. That might take a year just to get to that spot. These are things that with private property, we and the public doesn't necessarily hear about the negotiations between, you know, a developer and a landowner and when they're designing the project. But once something's submitted, okay, now we hear about it. And then it might take, you know, 6 months to get through the land use regulatory process. If they get approvals, then they go to the state and get a state traffic commission approval. That might be another 6 months. Then they have to design the building from a building permit perspective. That could be another 6 to 9 months. Then they have to get their financing. Then they look at, oh, what season is it? Can I start construction? Then these things take about 2 years to build, and now we're 4 years out until that thing's actually open. So this stuff, every stage of it, it takes a long time, especially when we're talking about public property. All right, Tom?
One of the things you talk about, your statistics are all for the entire town of Groton with the 38,000 folks. But we got multiple zoning districts here. How are you addressing that as you go forward in this thing? You're only talking to the town? Are you talking Groton Long Point and the city and Noank? You got 4 different, how are you doing that? I didn't hear any discussion on that.
Yeah, we're talking about what our office, Planning and Development Services, covers with our Planning and Zoning Commission, which we have a number of members here. So I know the town of Groton is the city, is Groton Long Point, is, Noank, all these places, but we're talking about what's within our zoning designation at least for the recommendations. But as we do these studies, we want to make sure the city can use this data and everybody else within the entirety of the town of Groton has this available, but we didn't break it down to, all right, well, let's subtract Noank, or let's subtract Groton Long Point, or let's subtract the city, because it's still part of the town of Groton and the town of Groton tax base.
How are you going to decide? It sounds like you're only going with the town in your recommendations here. Are you going to allocate so much to Noank this is your part of the 4,200 to Noank, this is so much to Groton Long Point, this is so much to the city? How are you going to handle that on the go-forward basis?
So, one, we are not going to allocate anything, but the decision makers of the town, our Planning and Zoning Commission, and then policies that our town council adopts and makes, are going to decide how much of that number do we want to bring into the town, and in what areas. The town might say, we don't want any more development, and that's it. And then what the city does is something different. And then, this is data that we can all use. But again, that's the devil's in the details of this stuff. Today, we're presenting numbers and data. And I don't know, Jeff, if you want to weigh in as well.
Just a reminder that this is not a quota. So it's not like we have 5,500 units and we have to figure out where they're going to go. Gosh darn it. So that, again, just want to reiterate that point, that is not what this is about. That is a number that demonstrates the demand, but it does not mean that the town is under any obligation to divvy it up and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We want to figure out as a community as these next steps, as John has already reiterated, what of these housing types do we think would be valuable? Where do we think they would be valuable? And you may find that, all right, once we put these housing types where we want them, in theory, maybe that would add 1,000 new units, and that's as far as we're comfortable going at this point. So that is what this is about. Is not about finding space to build 5,500 new houses.
And also the build-out scenarios that we're going to be doing are going to be specifically for town of Groton zoning, not the city.
I don't know if it falls within the purview of this study, but are they going to be addressing the negative impacts of a possibly 25% population increase, like wear and tear on the roads, more traffic, food deserts,
We're not getting into I think all of those impacts, but those are things that, again, our Planning and Zoning Commission, our council through their policies and things that they can do, have to weigh all this of what are the options of the do-nothing scenario, or address 10% of it, address 50% of it. And, somebody had asked, well, we're spending a lot of money on all these studies. At some point in time, we can't just keep studying. We hit a point of, paralysis by analysis. We do the best that we can to give you good data, and at some point you have to say, all right, well, Public Works, what's the capacity of the sewer treatment plant? Groton Utilities, Eversource, what are our energy availability? Groton Utilities, what do we have available for water? What are our road standards of what we're doing, and how can we work with DOT to maybe upgrade some things? And also, just because we zone and allow certain things to happen, it doesn't mean it's going to get built. Like, even I think in Tom's presentation, he talked about in the last few years, we've approved 1,200 units that are approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission, but building permits haven't been even applied for yet on those projects. And until hammers are swinging, nails are going in, foundations are going in the ground, those units aren't there and may never get built. So again, we got to look at all the scenarios, and these are things that the community as a whole needs to decide. What do you want and what are you willing to do to get there? As well as once new units come on board, you'll have more taxpayers to contribute to the grand list that can help pay for some of the improvements that are necessary.
And I'll just add that this also, as we mentioned at the very beginning, Groton's population is on a decline. It's the households that are increasing. So even if we're building these new houses and these new housing types that better meet the needs of the people in Groton, you're not necessarily adding more people, you're not necessarily adding more cars to the street, you're not necessarily adding more flush toilets. It's really just a redistribution of people into households and housing types that they better need. So part of this could be about an increase in population, but you could remain exactly where you are today in population, and it would really just be about providing those housing alternatives that you don't have today.
Hi, I'm just curious, there was stuff at the beginning of the study that said this has nothing to do with the plan of conservation and development, that's something else. When does the planning of conservation and development need to be signed off on? Because it has to go to the state, right? And it has to be by 2026. This whole study isn't going to be done until July next year, and I'm just wondering, do those lines cross? Do they stick out? Do they not cross at all? And if they don't cross, if the POCD has to be signed off by the town before this study's done, how is the Planning and Zoning Commission going to absorb some of the recommendations for places to put this the small dwelling kind of developments?
So a number of things. June 2026, I can't remember the exact date in June, the Plan of Conservation and Development needs to be approved by the state. So Horsley Witten Group is not only the lead on this project, they're also the lead on our Plan of Conservation and Development. We, in this room, I see a number of Planning and Zoning Commission members. We've asked all of them to watch these meetings. They will be given this data as we have it, but the way both of these projects lined up, yep, one's going to be done, really the Plan of Conservation and Development, a lot of it will be done prior to the end of this project, but a lot of the key data we're going to start having now. There's going to be more public input. In a worst case scenario, after we adopt the Plan of Conservation and Development, if there's major things that the community wants to change that require changes to the POCD, we can change the POCD. There's just a state and local process we have to follow, but a lot of the recommendations that if people want to make these changes, it's really going to be enabled through zoning changes that we might be able to address in a big picture some of those things within the Plan of Conservation and Development, as we're going through those drafts now with our Planning and Zoning Commission.
And just to follow up, if the state needs to approve it by June of 2026, when's the town need to have it submitted to the state?
We're actually back. Oh, the state does not approve it. Yeah.
So the June of 2026 is actually when you all are going to be done with that. Got it.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. All right. I will get to you in a minute. Yeah, just, or, let's see, Rachel lost her mic. So, yeah.
Just to follow up after hearing some additional information, so to clarify and confirm, you're just saying that these are the amount of dwellings that Groton's town could potentially handle. Again, there is the crossover with Groton City that we never acknowledge, but your point of seeing how much Groton Utilities is going to impact the grid, impact the water, I don't understand why we're not putting the cart before the horse. Also, how much available land is there that's not protected? How much is going to be conserved and remain green space? Shouldn't it be a total type of evaluation? Because why should we let 5,200 or 1,200 units go up but not see how it's going to impact the utilities beforehand? You don't want to put in 1,200 homes and then see what the draw is on our electrical grid. Why are we doing things kind of not hand in hand and cohesively?
So things are done hand in hand and cohesively. So when development projects are approved, they have to make sure they have available water, available sewer. There are a few parts to that question, as well as we talked about build-out analyses. So those are going to look at what's the available land in Groton. It's also, part of it is right now, there are assumptions that we have zoning minimum lot sizes in certain districts. Part of this is going to look at, well, are there some areas where we might want to reduce minimum lot sizes? There are some districts in town that the zoning might be, for example, a 12,000 square foot minimum lot size, but most of the houses and lots in that area might be a much smaller lot size existing. And when we look at historical lot patterns, and when we got smaller houses in some of those areas that have water and sewer, they were traditionally on smaller lots. Those are things that the community will look at and will be analyzed through this project. And as well as, we know that there's available sewer infrastructure. We know that there's a great amount of water infrastructure that we have available. So it's not, we're not trying to plan for things that we know there's not available infrastructure for. And again, a lot of those things are going to be done, at least from a build-out land analysis, as part of this project. Right now, approximately 30% of the town of Groton is already protected, conserved open space. It's a good number. There are other areas in town, you know, we talk about north of Route 95 or north of really Route 184. The land up there is not great. It's very rocky. It's very steep. We don't see a lot of development going that way, nor does it have great infrastructure. So there's a lot of land that's still not necessarily protected, but we don't expect it to be built at, you know, higher densities or things like that. I know there's another question over here.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the question about vacant properties in Groton. And John, you could probably speak on this better than I can, but the town of Groton has no control over some vacant properties because they're privately owned.
Yeah, you know, we often get questions about, well, why isn't more happening on Route 1, you know, our commercial centers, the big Y Plaza, why can't you make people do things? I can't make Kathy build an accessory dwelling unit on her home no different than I can't make a commercial developer change what they're doing on their property. If they don't want to, they're not going to. We can give incentives, we can create better zoning, we can give, you know, certain tax districts, but if people are happy with where they are, it's gonna stay that way. Just as I can't make any of you turn your single family homes into duplexes or anything else, we can only enable through a regulatory process and then hope that we get the development that we want. You know, with the things that we do, whether it's, you know, our plan of conservation and development and our zoning, we enable people to build and develop a community the way we want it. If we're getting development that we don't like, it's because of what's in the regulations that we need to do a better job of. Changing these regulations are incredibly difficult, not from a bureaucratic process, but more from getting community buy-in and agreement on what's the best thing for that neighborhood. A lot of people are supportive of things like, you know, we need more of this type of housing or this type of development, but I don't know if I really want it built too close to me. You know, that's where things get personal, and that's what, as a community, you all need to help come together and give good feedback to our Planning and Zoning Commission and our Town Council. Any other questions? Otherwise, we still got a little bit of food. Oh, I think Bryce has a couple.
So please interact with the boards. All right, there's a bunch of boards, a bunch of QR codes, little quick surveys you can take. We also have QR codes around for the website for this project where you can learn a lot more. We'll be updating it. Tomorrow we will have the full report on that website for those of you that are inclined to read through all the data, methodology, sources. It'll all be up there. And any future events. So of course we have our walking tour coming up on October 23rd at 4:30. I think a couple of us will be there. We'll be walking around Mystic, showing off the missing middle examples all throughout downtown Mystic. In November, we will be going to the Quantic Bridge area to do the same there. Okay?
And again, thank you all for coming. Great questions. You know, we don't have all the answers for this stuff, and we need your help making these things happen. So thanks for participating tonight, and thanks everybody.